Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Allia McCoy, and I am your host this evening. I want to welcome you to this remarkable event. This is hosted by the School of Information Sciences, as well as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Planning Committee. And we're just so glad to have all of you here. I'm an alum of the program, and currently I'm working as the university's social science librarian. My subject areas are African American studies, gender, sexuality, and women's studies, and urban studies and urban planning. And so because of the subject matter, I've kind of coined it a social justice librarian. I am passionate about the freedom to read as a librarian and also as a parent. I do have 3 children. My daughter is in the audience this evening, and I also have 2 other children as well. And they're curious and they're eager to read about the world. And I went to library school because I believe in them being able to take advantage of that curiosity and all of the freedom that libraries provide to children. And so, in a world where intellectual freedom is sometimes challenged, it's librarians who often stand as the guardians of our access to information. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from some exceptional alumni who will share their experiences and insights into what it means to protect our right to read. I'm pleased to introduce you to our moderator, Lance Werner. And Lance brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to this panel. As the executive director of the Kent District Library, he has been a formidable advocate for libraries and their vital role in our communities. When I was a student, I remember seeing him on the cover of Library Journal as Librarian of the Year, which I thought was really, really cool. Lance's influence extends beyond the library world, as shown by his recent recognition on the Grand Rapids 200 list, a testament to his influence and impact in West Michigan and beyond. Thank you, Lance, for being here today to guide us through this insightful discussion, as well as our other panelists. And now I'd like to introduce you to our additional panelists. Amy Churchill, the director of the Lapeer District Library. Amy is a seasoned librarian with more than 2 decades of experience. She's been a staunch defender of books and has been actively fighting censorship efforts in her community. Nakenya Lewis Yarborough, a youth services librarian at the Belleville Area District Library. She is passionate about fostering awareness of diverse books by authors from historically underrepresented backgrounds. And as the head of the library's comic book club, and teen and manga clubs, she is an avid believer that graphic novels and manga are real books. Jordan Wright is the assistant director at the Ferndale Area District Library. His library was recently the target of a Hide the Pride campaign against LGBTQ books during Pride Month. With the help of the community, Jordan and his coworkers were able to quickly replace the books that were targeted by religious groups during the censorship campaign. Sadly, our final panelist, Selena Aguilera, is unable to join us this evening. However, our event this evening is going to take place, and this is during Banned Books Week, an annual celebration of the freedom to read. It spotlights both historical and contemporary attempts to censor books in libraries and schools. The week aims to bring together librarians, journalists, teachers, and readers of all kinds to champion the freedom to seek and express ideas, even those considered unorthodox or unpopular. Once again, everyone, welcome to Defending Access, Librarian Perspectives on Banned Books. And it's nice to see so many of you in person today. And we're happy to welcome our alumni and friends from across the country who are joining us online. Thank you to all of you as well. I'm certain that today's discussion will leave us all with a deeper understanding and appreciation for the vital role that librarians play in upholding our right to read. Thank you for joining us in this important conversation. Before I turn things over to Lance, I want to remind you that immediately following this discussion, there will be a brief reception just outside the auditorium. We'll have coffee, cookies, cider, and donuts. So please stick around to keep the conversation going. And now, without further ado, take it away, Lance.
Well, thank you, Allia. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for being here. And thank you to everybody who's tuning in and everybody who's here in the audience today. I'm Lance Werner. I'm director of the Kent District Library. And, it's interesting, what we're really talking about when we talk about the subject of book bans is we're talking about attempts to curtail, freedom to read. But freedom to read really is related to the First Amendment. And the First Amendment's been in effect since 1791 in this country. And there's a reason it's the First Amendment. Everything else that happens in this country really is kind of based on the foundation of the First Amendment. When we talk about the First Amendment, we talk about freedom to read, but we also talk about freedom to think, freedom to speak, freedom to write, freedom to be who we are. One of the great ironies about book challenges is that the people that are challenging books are actually utilizing the First Amendment to launch their challenges. I kind of think of it as maybe standing on the branch and sawing it off behind you. So it's critical that we do this. You know, it's interesting. I was here over spring break with my family, and we went to the Henry Ford Museum. And what a fantastic resource that is. But I was walking through the civil rights displays, and I was reading about Dr. King and Malcolm X and the suffrage movement and all of it. And I thought, you know, we're living history right now. We really are. And what's interesting about living history is that nobody who's living history chooses to live history. If you're living history, that means you're living in a time where there's duress, where there's impact, where people are challenging and trying to take away civil rights. So we don't choose to live history. History chooses us. And I say all that because this is the most important work that any of us will ever do in library land, because we're not fighting for titles. We're fighting for the First Amendment. We're fighting for freedom. We're fighting for freedom of ideas, freedom of expression, freedom for you to be you without judgment. It's not the library's place to judge. It's our duty to uphold freedom and to make sure that it's here now and for generations to come. And we recognize that any freedoms that we lose now are gone. And what a terrible tragedy that'll be, not just for the library but profession, but for this entire country. When we lose the freedom in America to say what we want to say, to write what we want to write, to read what we want to read, and to be who we want to be, we're no longer America. And so it's worth fighting for. And so no matter what happens to me in the rest of my career, this will always be the most important work that I've ever done. And I think it's a great honor of my life to have an opportunity to stand for the right, to stand for the right for everybody else to stand up and be who they are and to be proud of who that is. The right to access what you want to do and to share your ideas. That's really what makes this country, and it is certainly worth fighting for. So with that, I kind of wanted to just kind of go through, I mean, you've heard kind of my perspective on it. I'd love to hear from our panelists today. I mean, how does it strike you? And we're considering this whole thing. I mean, obviously I'm a lawyer too, please don't judge me. I'm a lawyer too, so I mean, I take a very sort of legal centric view of this. But how does that strike you? I mean, all of us have had experiences on this panel, myself included. How does it strike you when you think of this in a larger context? To me, it's much bigger than libraries and books. We're really talking about America. So please feel free. I'd love to hear from you.
I'll go ahead. I agree with Lance completely that libraries are being used in the political landscape as those people are looking for a wedge. They're looking for a way to break through and expand the control that they would like to implement over books and what's available in their community in different ways. We're a litmus test. If we can get a wedge in with libraries, we will advance that. And I really do consider us to be on the front lines of defending that freedom.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, I think it's about erasing people or ideals that you don't want out there. And so by banning books or certain books that are about certain groups of people or certain ideals, that's what it's about, more so than just banning books. It rolls out into other areas of society and politics, and it's a part of a bigger machine.
Thank you so much.
I'm a little embarrassed to say that I actually didn't know this week was Banned Books Week.
It is?
I only figured it out because one of my colleagues was doing a different panel today. Said, I'm doing a Banned Books panel today. I said, is it at Wayne State? And it wasn't. But I say that because the last few years have just felt like the banned book decade or the banned book years. That this is kind of at the forefront of what we do now constantly. Your metaphor about sawing off the branch behind you really resonated with me, Lance. I keep thinking that this will run out of steam because it doesn't seem like a sustainable political action. Most people, when you ask them, MLA did polls this year about whether or not people in Michigan support book bans or challenges, and overwhelmingly, Michiganders don't. And yet here we are.
Unfortunately, and thank you all for your comments. And this phenomena is not limited to Michigan. As you know, if you've been reading the news, I mean, it's occurring all over the country. Schools and libraries are both under attack by those that would try to take away books, to repress ideas. And this movement, in my opinion, is really born out of fear. I think it's my theory that we're really dealing with two broad groups of people. One group is much larger than the other group. The two groups, I've dubbed them the true believers, who are really fearful that something is actually going on. And I think that's the bulk of the anti-book movement. And then there are people with political aspirations who recognize that fear can breed followership and fundraising and try to capitalize on that to try to kind of get more liftoff for political campaigns. That's my thought. And I also just want to take a moment too to recognize that book bans are not limited to one political party. Book bans occur on both sides of the aisle. It's not purely political. And I also would say that I think that a lot of people that come in and say things, even though they say things sometimes that are obtuse and wrong and completely false, I don't think that they are necessarily evil people or poor, bad intended. I think that they believe in the things that they say, but I feel like perhaps they don't know what's going on, or they aren't practicing critical thinking skills. They haven't taken the time to kind of learn about the Constitution and open themselves up and say, okay, I don't like this, but that doesn't mean nobody can like it if I don't like it. Because frankly, America is what it is because people can like things when other people don't like it. At my house, I love Indian food. I'm the only person at the table that loves Indian food, but that doesn't mean we can't ever have Indian food at my house because I can have Indian food. It's just not a no Indian food. I always like to make food analogies. It's not a no Indian food environment where I live. Everybody has that opportunity to kind of be who they are and to engage with things. And that's why we have the First Amendment. But I'd be curious to talk to our panelists today and ask, what's your experience with dealing with the folks that are coming in and trying to ban materials that are maybe send emails or show up in person? I mean, I recognize they're very passionate. You know, we've dealt with them as well. But what's your experience? I mean, who do you think these folks are?
In my experience, and my experience is very specific, so I can't speak for everyone. The group that has engaged with Lapeer, with our library, they were not regular library users, not people who walked through the door and were suddenly shocked to see something on the shelf that they didn't agree with. They are following directions from elsewhere, specifically coming in with lists of books. They are not aware of our policies, our mission, our philosophy, our work, our stance on parental responsibility. None of those things cross their mind or they have no experience with. And they're not receptive to engaging in those conversations. The traditional way of dealing with conflict with active listening and empathy and talking to people in my particular situation is not applicable. This was a targeted attack, and talking was not an option for a way out.
So for me, we have been more fortunate than maybe some other places in that we have not had anyone come in and in person challenge any staff members or any, attacks in that way. We did have a passive kind of incident in that, I guess if you want to call it that, in that when we had displays up for Pride Month, one of our pages did find some books in the trash can and was like, oh, okay, that's a little odd. And in the fact that it was odd because where the trash cans were at where the page found the books at, we don't even keep the trash cans by the picture book stack, you know, so someone had to actively move the trash can over there and throw them away. So they were fine. We put them back out, but then later we again found books and it was like cracked. And so that was one of the first experiences that I've ever had with something like that. So we don't know who did it. And that, you know, was kind of daunting because I think it's important to put displays up that represent everybody in the community. All people should be represented, you know, and just speaking of a time of importance of representation is when we put our teen display up for Pride Month one year, myself and my coworker, before we could even get that display up, we had teens approaching us, taking books out of hand. So obviously those kids wanted to read the books that we had. I'd even had a book that I was actually going to read, but of course I gave it up so that, you know, our teen could take it home. We also had teens who did not have cards get cards that day. And that was because they saw that display was, you know, going up in front of their face right then and there. We were pulling books and putting displays up. And it was like, oh, didn't know you had these books. This is great. Led to a bigger question of, do you have books, you know, X, Y, Z? And we were able to, you know, get those books for them too.
Thank you.
I'm going to let Jordan speak in just a moment. So in my specific experience, I have been threatened with arrest. I've been harassed. I've sat through hours of public comment. We've had protests. We've had books thrown in the garbage. We've had hate mail mailed to every single staff person, threatening them with arrest as well. I have a legal defense team for the ACLU. I have had people slandering me. I have experienced anything you can think of as fallout from a book challenge situation has happened to me and happens on a continuous basis. So
Ugh.
I think, not to cut you off, Lance and I were just talking about that. And I was just like, that must be a tremendous amount of stress and angst for you and your staff to have people that combative and to make it personal and an attack on you. And I noticed across, I've been reading the joint, the school library journal, where there are a number of other people who are giving lawsuits because they're, you know, other library staff or community members against organizations. They're taking them to court because of slander and, you know, different things.
I've had to learn how to compartmentalize quite a bit because there is no end to the actual work that you have to do as a library director. So to kind of just sink into this situation and let it be your only focus isn't possible. So you do kind of compartmentalize, excuse me. And I have had to develop a really thick skin. We've had to take care of ourselves. Our next staff day is focused on almost the topic would probably be most accurately described as PTSD recovery. It is the littlest amount I could do for my staff to try to empower them and hear them and keep us focused on our strategic plan, our mission, our goals, the wonderful things that we do every single day. So it is exceptionally stressful. It's a gut check moment. You are not prepared for it, no matter what you might think. Library school doesn't prepare for you. Your career experience beforehand doesn't prepare you for it. Nothing really prepares you for it. And it's a surreal experience.
Thank you. Is there anything you would like to add?
Just that in our incident in Ferndale, you know, fairly mild in comparison, obviously. But I guess it is worth pointing out that I think in most of these scenarios, it's a small percentage of the population. It's a loud group. But I think even in, Ferndale is a notoriously progressive area, but even in most other communities, the library is still really popular. So I think that's kind of what drives us and our staff through, is that the community support. And after we went public with what happened with Ferndale, we received just an outpouring of support, and people are regularly still stopping by just to thank us for doing what we do and being there. And I hope that you've been getting some of that here.
We are overwhelmed with support. However, it takes so much positive energy to outweigh the negative that it literally has to come in at a rate of like 10 to 1. We've gotten flowers, we get candy, we get donuts, we get letters. I've got some cute warrior socks someone sent to me. We are absolutely overwhelmed with support from our community. It has been one of the things that helps us all get through this situation. But it really is an interesting psychological concept that the negative weighs on you so much more, and it just reinforces what the library is here for everyone, to me, to keep doing it every day, that we are doing the right thing. So we are overwhelmed with support. I hate to paint it in a negative light, because it is the majority of the people support us.
Okay, thank you all so much for your answers. I have a new direction to talk about. One of the things that occurs when we're addressing book challenges is the whole notion, the whole question of, why do you have these materials? And inevitably, these materials are titles about people of color or the LGBTQIA plus community or something to that effect. So why do you have these materials? And so part of the answer is that the public library serves the public. And so at the Kent District Library, and I assume is like the same with most libraries, we try to have a representative collection. So we want our collection to represent the population that we are serving. And so we try to look at demographic data. And so it's important that there's representation in the collection for everyone who's coming in, so that they can see themselves in the items that we have. Because if there's no representation, there's no interest. Those people don't feel connected with the organization, and we have failed in our duty as public library people. And so then I have the question that comes up, well, what about me and my kids? And our position is that the public library exists to help parents parent their own kids, not the neighbor kids, not the kids down the street, not my kids, your kids, their kids, or those kids, your kids. We want parents to connect with their kids. If there's a situation where there's a concern by a parent about what's in the library, then the parent needs to talk to their own children. There's no right for them to talk to anybody else's children or demand that everybody's children be stuck with their decision about something. It's not reasonable and it's not constitutional. And so that's why we have the First Amendment. So we really promote the parents parent their own children. And then people say, well, I just dropped my kids off at the library and they're yours. But here's the thing about public libraries. We have no legal authority to act in loco parentis, to stand in the shoes of the parent. It is the parent's position to stand in the shoes of the parent. In fact, I always say, do you really want the government to raise your kids? Because I don't. And I would venture to say most people don't. And we are the government as public libraries. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. And then after that, I'd like to really kind of discuss the Miller test and some of the things you're hearing when you hear challenges about particular items. But what are your comments about that, about the spirit of the public library and this whole idea of us supporting parents to be parents to their own children, not parents to society?
Well, I can tell you that just from a personal aspect, I was a voracious young reader, a precocious young reader. I took out many age inappropriate books from my public library, and I hid them under my bed. And when my mother would do a sweep of the books under my bed, and she would get them out and hold them in front of me, where did these come from? And I'd tell her where I got them from. Never once did she blame the librarian for letting me check those books out. She takes that responsibility upon herself, and she takes the time to talk to me about what's inside those books, what I might have learned. Do I have any questions that might have come up from my reading of those books? And we go on and on. She pretends like, you know, we go to the library, I get what I want, I take it home, I hide it under the bed, and we do this over and over again. Never once would it have crossed my mother's mind to blame the library, the librarian, the staff, anyone else for what her child was reading. And that is a philosophy that sticks with me. It's what we believe as public librarians. You are responsible for what your children read. We provide a wide range of materials for you to select from. We can provide some guidance and some advice. And if you feel like your particular viewpoint is not represented in our collection, engage with us and tell us titles that you think we're missing. We will buy them. Most of the time, if we have the money and the resources available at the end of the budget year and you make suggestions and you're in our community, we're going to purchase those titles for you. There is an opportunity for representation across the board that we would like to provide. So you have to engage with us sometimes, though, to make that representation come through, because we might not be available of maybe some of the resources you utilize for getting books might not be mainstream for us. Titles we might not see in some of our review journals or our normal buying sources. You might have to engage if you feel like your particular viewpoint is not represented at the public library. We want you to engage with us and let us know.
Thank you. Anyone else care to weigh in?
I think she summed that up. I read books I weren't supposed to read, but they were at the house. They were like Harlequin romance. So, which really aren't that saucy if you think about it now, but I thought it was. And my philosophy is pretty much the same as yours in that we're not telling anyone that they have to read anything. These things are available here, and each family needs to decide what is the best type of material for their child to check out. And that's, you know, that's DVDs, it's music, it's books, it's anything that may be there, because libraries have more than just books. But as the parent, you have to monitor what your child is checking out, and you don't get to say what should be in the collection based on what you think, thinking that because you believe that you don't want that access for your family, it's not a good choice for your family to make the decision that no one in the community should have access to that book. That's not how it works.
I keep a document pinned next to my desk. It's the ALA's Freedom to Read statement from early 1950s, probably written during the McCarthy era. And if you haven't read it, you should print it out and take it with you. But one of my favorite parts of it is basically that the ALA agrees that ideas can be dangerous. But they sum it up by saying that the suppression of ideas is more dangerous.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers. I now want to kind of just revisit very quickly some of the things around this whole topic of actually withdrawing books and the question of why is this on the shelf? Now, I'm not sure how it works in your library, but I assume that's probably very similar to ours. One of the things that people don't understand about libraries is that library shelf space is at a premium. And so when somebody comes to me and they're like, why is this on the shelf? We say, because generally speaking, we're a popular materials library. It was on a bestseller list or recommended title list by one of the publishers, or somebody requested it. And oh, by the way, it's still on the shelf because people are checking it out. Because if it's not getting checked out at the Kent District Library, it gets weeded. So if you find something on the shelf, chances are it's on the shelf because people are reading it. Somebody else in the community has expressed interest. We have a floating collection, so things float around. And the nice thing about that is that each of our branches can kind of be representative of their own community interests. So we're able to dial that in. So that's one thing. People are checking out. That's why it's there. Then there's this whole question and comment that I hear quite often about, what about a rating system? Well, good news, friends, there's already sort of a rating system in libraries. And the rating system is, where's the book located in the library? Is it in, is it in the board book section for pre-readers, or is it young adult, or is it adult, or is it in the teen section? That's essentially a rating system. So if your 6-year-old is going and browsing books in the adult section, there's going to be adult content in them, because that's the way it works. That's why they're arranged the way they are. We don't have, G, PG, PG-13, R, NC-17, those kind of ratings, but our ratings are essentially wherever it's at in the library, we can give you a pretty good idea of what the content is. And so I'm just curious. I mean, I'd like to hear from you. I assume that your practices are similar. Shelf space is at a premium.
So our main library is a 100-year-old Carnegie, and space everywhere is a premium. Office space, shelf space, parking space. Space is what governs many of our decisions. And when you're at capacity, I don't think the general public realizes that you'll be at a book in, book out situation. For every book that you order, a book needs to leave because you're at capacity. So if you're ordering 1,500 books every year, 1,500 books need to leave. Those books are usually non-performers. They don't circulate. They have very little interest. They have no historical value. So if an item is still here, it's because other people in your community have expressed an interest in it and are using it. And that can get a little bit lost in this. The particular book that we had so much consternation over was so popular, it had a 10-person waiting list and was never actually in the library because it was constantly checked out. Where is it at in the library? Where is it at in the library? Was the question I would be shouted at me all the time. And I'd go, it isn't. Someone has it checked out. It has never, ever been on the shelf in the library for more than a day while it was on the hold shelf waiting for the next patron. So we are absolutely in the situation when it comes to space. We follow a very widely publicized standard material selection policy that's available for anyone in the public to look at any time. And our staff follow that policy and buy materials based on the criteria listed there.
Thank you, Amy. How about any other comments about your practices and your locations?
I would say just one quick comment about spacing that I found funny. Many years ago, I was working at another suburban Detroit library, and somebody came in and said, "Where are all your books? These shelves are all 3/4 full." They're checked out. So, I mean, truly, when you walk into a well-used library, the shelves may look half empty. But that's because people are reading the books, which is the whole point.
One of the things that I think is so interesting about this whole idea of withdrawing items and things being checked out is, a lot of our collections actually develop from patron input. We get requests for items. We try to purchase them if we can. And I mean, so the collection really does reflect the community. And we have political items on both sides of the aisle, representing extreme views on both sides of the aisle, from board books on up, because that's what people are asking for. It's not for us to choose whether or not something's good. And I always hear about this whole idea about, oh, the library's got an agenda. Yeah, we sure do. Our agenda's no agenda. We serve everybody, the public. That's the whole agenda. There's got to be representation in the collection, and that's it. We don't pick winners and losers. That's not our place. And so talking about that and kind of easing that into the whole idea of when is it okay for a library to actually withdraw an item? It is okay, legally permissible. The only time that it is legally permissible for us to pull something off the shelf that isn't being deaccessioned because it's not being checked out is that if it's found unconstitutional. So what does that mean? If you read online and you listen to what people say, people have a really huge sort of like number of ideas about what unconstitutional is, but it's not that. There's really only two types of speech that are not protected by the Constitution. The first type of speech is child pornography. It is legally defined. And the second type of speech are things that are obscene. Now, what's notable is that a library cannot legally buy things that are considered child pornography or obscene, unless you're doing your collection development on the dark web. And I don't think there are a lot of libraries that are doing that. So what is obscene? I hear people's like, oh, it's obscene. It's obscene. Well, there's a test. The Supreme Court has actually defined obscene, and I'm going to read it to you. It's called the Miller test. So the Miller test for obscenity includes the following criteria. Number one, whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest. Number two, whether the work depicts or describes sexual conduct in a patently offensive way defined by the applicable state law. And number three, whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. That's the test. And oh, by the way, only a court has a legal authority to make the determination as to something, whether or not something is actually considered obscene. So it has to be litigated to figure that out. I mean, we do the best that we can, but we can't just take the money that we get from the public and go buy obscene materials. It's not legal. We can't go buy drugs either, not legal. We can't go buy machine guns either, not legal. Same thing, it's not legal. So for something to actually be considered obscene, it would have to pass the Miller test and be considered obscene. It's a high, high bar. Just because there's one picture in an entire book of two same-sex people holding hands does not make the whole book obscene. You might not like that idea, and that's your privilege. You are exercising your First Amendment rights, not liking that idea. But you have no right to take that away from everybody else. You have a right not to look at it yourself. And so I just want to talk about the Miller test and what actually occurs. And I want to talk to all of you about your experiences with people kind of making these arguments and how you've approached them.
Well, I want to, before I answer that particular question, I want to go back to something Lance said before he started about the library has no agenda. And I want to reiterate that. And I want to be very clear when I say it is not enough to say that. You have to implement that in your decision-making every single day. And you have to continuously show that to your community over and over and over again so that you can build those foundations of trust. It is not enough to say that the library doesn't have agenda if you are not following that through when it comes to your policies and your decision-making, your meeting room use, your displays, your collection development. You have to see that through to fruition in all areas of what we do. My experience in dealing with the Miller test in this particular issue is that there hasn't been a lot of interest in the factual basis of the Miller test and what it does or what it stands for, or the fact that a book has to pass or fail the Miller test to actually be considered obscene. When certain words are latched onto to inflame, to stoke fear, and obscenity is one of those words. It's very hard for people to let that go. They're rationally, you aren't going to be able in most cases to have a discussion with them about the book does not meet the Miller test. It is not obscene. That is unlikely to sink in when someone is a true believer and they firmly believe that what they're dealing with is obscenity, because they've made a personal determination on what obscenity is, and it is their right to do that. But they cannot spread that personal determination to everybody else. So there is that aspect. I haven't had any luck in trying to explain the Miller test to anybody that I've interacted with in this situation.
We actually, I tried to explain it to somebody recently, and they said, well, I did a Facebook poll, and there were several people, like 15, that agreed with me. It's like, well, thank you for your efforts, but that.
How large is your service population?
420,000 people.
Yeah, I get a lot of, we represent a very large group, and they'll have like 77 signatures. And I think to myself, well, my service population is over 60,000 people. We don't respond to petitions anyway, but come back to me when you have over 30,000 signatures, and maybe we'll actually start a discussion. It doesn't mean that whatever you're interested in is going to be implemented, but we might be able to start talking then. And I don't think the numbers really resonate in that way.
Thank you. We're actually kind of getting a little long in the tooth here. We have about 4 more minutes before we start answering questions. So I have kind of a final thing, but before that, go Warriors! Woo! All right, done. I felt like you needed to do a plug for a university. I love this place. But anyway, you know, I think about what's going on right now and about all of the sort of anger around it. Okay, but I think about the long game. You know, what's the long game? What's the end game here around trying to prohibit the freedom to read what you want to read, to try to curtail people's First Amendment rights? Where does that take us? Well, I mean, there has been situations across the country where books were challenged and there was state law passed and they were pulled off. And then other books that they didn't want to have pulled off, like the Bible, were pulled off. And then suddenly they're like, wait, hold on a sec. That doesn't fit with what I wanted. The problem is when you start taking away First Amendment rights, there's really no bottom to the hole. I mean, we could get to our point where we basically, I'm being a little flip now, have a couple of old phone books, you know, in the collection, and probably not a cookbook because somebody will have a gluten allergy. So where is the end of this? And so I want to know, what's your opinion? I think this thing goes on a while longer. I think there'll always be a bit of a heightened sort of scrutiny given to what's in our collection. Fine, ask questions. But I mean, long term, I don't see this lasting for a long time because I think people, frankly, in my opinion, in this country like to have their civil rights and don't want the government telling them what to read. What's your thought?
Well, I mean, people banning books is not new,
No,
right? So I think it probably goes through cycles of being more heightened at times, and then it'll kind of have a lull, and then it'll come back just like everything else in society, right? Things kind of have a cycle of how things happen. But people aren't aware, I think sometimes, that this even is a thing and that it's happening. And I mean, just like the general public, as I posted this event on Facebook, someone said, people are doing that? Yeah, they're doing that. I think I encourage everyone to look at ALA's challenge ban book list and then look at the reasons why people are choosing to, because when you talk about like things being obscene or profanity, you'll find books on there that you just really are wondering why would they challenge that book. You've got the Bible, like you said, Captain Underpants, Harry Potter, which is wildly popular, you know, a number of books.
I do think that this is going to pop up in local situations for a little bit longer. Our situation is actively resolved. Our library board voted unanimously to uphold my decision to keep both challenge books in the collection, but our situation is not over. There's long-term effects to that type of decision making. I do think
Can you share what books are being challenged, or can you not?
Yes, the titles Genderqueer and Fred Gets Dressed. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with Fred Gets Dressed, but it's a children's book by award-winning author Peter Brown. Fred is a young boy who hates wearing clothes like many young children. And Fred romps around the house in the nude, in the buff. You see a cheek at one point. But that's not Fred's greatest crime. Fred's greatest crime is that he tries on his mother's clothes and puts some makeup on. And the situation was not resolved by Fred getting beaten. The parents actually joined in and talked to Fred and had a grand time. And that was the reason that that book was challenged. I have college-aged kids, and I don't live in the same community where I work. And when this started happening, they were like, when you get in your car in the morning, do you go into a time warp? Like, this is literally happening right now. And I do think it's a cycle. One thing that I know isn't a cycle is that your public library is going to open tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And they're going to open the day after that and the day after that. And we aren't going anywhere. So we will withstand these challenges, and we will continue to do the work that we do in our communities.
So we have so many questions to answer and a very small time to answer them. So we're going to try to get through as many as humanly possible. one question that popped up here when I was talking, somebody asked if we're talking about book bans from individuals or governmental book bans. And frankly, at the end of the day, there's no difference because both things are trying to take away other people's First Amendment rights. They are treated the same way. If they're litigated, they'd be treated the same way. So the ACLU or Penn America or ACLU would come after them the same way. So I'm going to go through these questions and try to get through as many of them as I can. One was, are there particular groups driving these hostile initiatives? So we're going to go be real brief. What's your experience?
Yes.
That's boom right there.
Yes.
Boom. I agree. And I think that there are groups, but I think a lot of them are inspired by groups like Moms for Liberty and some of these sort of like pop political groups. And they're just kind of latching on. It's kind of how QAnon worked. Anyway, yes, I think so. Besides showing support for librarians, what can college students do to help mitigate the banned books movement? I have an idea. You know, what'd be cool is that you all would see what's going on and be like, this is ridiculous, and would get involved and get on boards and get involved in your local municipality and make your voices heard and fight for your rights. Because here's the whole thing. If you don't fight for your rights, you won't have any rights to fight for.
Well, Lance, there are high school students in some areas who have risen up and gone to their local schools because, we don't have a media specialist on the panel, but a lot of things are happening in the schools, and those students are speaking up for themselves. They are holding book clubs outside of their school site, reading, books that they want to read that may have been pulled. There have been authors who have supported them and sent, hundreds of books to them in titles. So students are standing up for themselves.
Yeah.
Getting involved on a local level, if you can, is so important. Having a young board member is a perspective that every board should have, and it's a little bit rare. I know time is precious, and I know generationally we're all kind of programmed to serve in a little different way. I do believe this newest generation coming of age has a level of civic involvement that hasn't been seen in many generations. Probably, I was raised by hippies, so probably since, maybe my parents' generation. I'm thrilled to see it. I'm a little embarrassed myself that I think I'm pretty representative of my generation. We eschew any involvement in that type of thing. We're very kind of self-focused, and we're not as involved in civic engagement. So I would encourage you to be involved, to vote, to make your voices heard, and to let your local librarians know that you support them and that you're aware of what they're doing, even if you're not using their services.
Anything else to add, or get to the next one?
Run for library board.
Love it. At the end of the day, the most important thing any of us can do is to show up when it matters and stand up when it matters. And if you don't do that, shouldn't expect much. First question here I have is, do you see banned books as an infringement of the freedom of speech as guaranteed by the First Amendment? My answer is yes.
Yes.
Here's another one. Have there been any efforts to ban books in Southeast Michigan? Which books by which groups? I don't have an answer.
We don't necessarily have a representative here from a library in Southeast Michigan that has maybe faced a formal book challenge, but I do believe I read that Rochester Hills Public Library saw some challenges within the last year, in Salem South Lyon. I know that Ferndale has had their own
Dearborn Public
Schools. Yes. Had a very prominent, that situation was in the paper for months. So there are isolated incidents in all areas of the state. There's not a specific area of the state that could look around and say, we're so enlightened here, we would never ban books.
I'm going to go to the third question. I wish we had about another hour to answer questions. I'm sorry, but we're going to go quick. How can we advocate or educate about the importance of having diverse stories and voices within library collections to deter book banning, specifically to deter the banning of books by LGBTQIA plus and POC authors?
I mean, I think we advocate by having those things in our collection, and not, letting anyone strong arm you and you don't have that. I'm very proud of the collection that we have at our library. And I think, you know, we did the work. What I did when I first started working there was who's not represented on the shelves. So as a new person starting at that building, who do I not see here? This is where I'm going to start at first. These are the books that I'm going to buy to fill, and that's filling a gap that's in your collection, right? Because that's what you do. You look at what's there, and are you missing representation? Or if it's, you know, even in nonfiction, are these books outdated? They can be outdated in fiction as well. So I think that's how you advocate for that. In your story times, read a variety of books from a variety of authors representing a variety of people. In your displays, if it's a Valentine's Day display, it doesn't matter what the topic is. It's important to have a variety of those books. When I face out books, I'm aware and do it in a very conscious manner of, you know, what representation is up. And that's for everyone, right? Because we've got the whole thing with windows and mirrors. You know, we want other people to see reflections of themselves, but we want other people to also get a look in to, you know, how other people are thinking, how other people live, how they feel.
I think representation on staff is critical too. Absolutely critical.
Paying attention to what your patrons are asking for. If you are continuously requesting items through Melcat in a specific genre or area because you do not have them on your shelf or anywhere close by, maybe that's a need that you need to look at, a collection gap that you need to look at. I think staff representation is incredibly important. And I think we do that every day when we're building our collections. We try to represent as wide of a range as possible.
We have two more questions. I prioritized viewer questions over panelist, host, faculty, and staff questions. So the last two questions that I have record of from viewers are, the first one is, have any of you had any interaction with the Biden administration's new anti-book ban coordinator, Matt Nosanchuk? I probably killed the name, but not me.
No.
Nope. And then the last one is, how do we advocate against what children are taught to read? My answer to this is be a parent. You know, I mean, you have a kind of a duty as a parent to be involved in your kids' lives, but you have no right to advocate on behalf of the neighbor's kids or the kids down the street or the kids in a different city. You are a parent in your house or a caretaker in your house. That's it. And so that's what we say.
And I would say if that we was meant to imply librarians, we, in that case, do not advocate for what your children are supposed to read. We trust you to do that.
Anything else? Do we have time for, oh, in the back?
What would you do if another case came up like Madonna's sex? On the New York Times bestseller list, obviously legal because it was being sold in bookstores everywhere in the country.
If somebody requested it at the Kent District Library, it was an adult book, this title, it wasn't a board book for kids. If somebody requested it, we would try to purchase it. We'd put it in the adult collection.
There was a lot of pushback from many libraries not wanting to sell this year.
We don't run our purchases through a morality lens.
Nope.
We do not. So I would say the push against genderqueer is not that different. Highly reviewed, extremely popular, checked out all the time. And there is no, if patron requested, we purchased that, and we did not run that through a morality lens or a potential trouble lens. We purchased the book.
Well, and the other thing is, it's not the only book in the library. I mean, and if we were to get Madonna's book, it wouldn't be the only book in the library. And if you don't like it, you know what? Don't check it out. You know, I mean, that's kind of how we look at things. Anybody else want to add anything? All right, so do I have time to get to faculty, staff, all these other questions? Oh, lay it on us.
Graphic novels, comic books, or manga that have been, especially been the target of book fans. Can you name any?
We had check please
Yeah,
as
I
one of the
can't name
titles.
like a bunch of titles at this point, but the answer to that is yes. Yeah. I mean, comic books are on that list, and manga too. And even, with media specialists, you know, they, have to take a look at what they're going to have in the schools. And, and that's a different kind of, I wish we had a media specialist on the panel, because that's a different, kind of thing that's happening. For me, I'm in a public library. So we're buying the things, and I work in youth services. It's usually a matter of where should it land? So does it land in the children's department? Does it land in the teen department? And in some cases, if we buy it and we're like, oh, this doesn't go in teen, we're going to put it in the adult department. So ultimately it ends up in the collection. It's just a matter of choosing the appropriate place for it. With media specialists, they've got different things that they're, how they're running their collection. In a public library, it's just like, well, you're bringing your kids here, or they're coming here. It's up to you whether they check that out.
Absolutely. It is a different thing. And we haven't really talked at all about how school media centers and school librarians are dealing with these issues. Their legal duties, they do have a duty of act in loco parentis center collections. I'll be right back with you. And they have a duty to support the curriculum of the school.
And Lance, let's just talk about the fact that some of them are losing their jobs.
Yep.
Even in teachers' classrooms in some states, they are not allowed to have a classroom collection of books.
Yep.
That they have to get it from the media center, which is also being very tightly monitored on, what's in that media center.
Yep.
So, having the wrong book in your classroom might cost you your job, depending on where you live at.
Yeah.
If you go down the rabbit hole of just reading all the updates on what's happening with, media specialists, even in the public sector, maybe a little less at a college or university, it's kind of exhausting. You're sad by the time you're done reading all the things that are happening to like colleagues, and, like, even if it's not happening to you, you're like, oh my goodness, this is so stressful. This must be horrible for them to have to deal with this day in and day out on, such an aggressive level. I would say, reading the school library journal and some, other magazines, these are like from the last 2 months. There are so many articles about court cases, how media specialists are collecting now and pulling back a little bit on buying some material because they just don't want to have the hassle.
Yeah.
And that's kind of scary too.
Yeah, absolutely. Something you want to say?
I do think to add, one of the reasons why graphic novels might be getting hit a little bit harder is twofold. One, they're immensely popular, so they're the things that are probably most likely to end up underneath a pillow or whatever. But also a parent can flip through them and see anything that's remotely spicy, whereas you actually have to read what your kids are reading, which a lot of parents don't want to do. So.
Thank you. In the back.
Okay, I'm also married to a lot of media specialist for 40 years, and as a same we've done intellectual freedom advisory. She did have one person in her district that refused to buy any sex ed material for the collection. I wrote an article on sex ed library, and it was amazing how much the literature says there are even many public libraries that refuse to buy sex ed material. She bought them. She said the students didn't necessarily check them out, but they moved around the library constantly. So there was great interest. And again, the media specialist doesn't have the same privilege you have in public library because they do act in local collections.
That is correct. Thank you for that comment. And frankly, it makes me a little sad. But yeah, it's a different environment in school. than what we deal with. We have the sort of privilege of being a little bit of purists up here. I mean, our duty is to support the Constitution and protect civil rights. The end. There's nothing else attached to that. That's what we do. That's the whole thing. So when you're in the school, there's a lot of other obligations that attach to your role that we don't have to deal with. And so, yeah, it's tough. It's tough. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
I was just curious of all the like emotional strain that book challenges have caused you and your colleagues. I was curious about whether or not within like the library profession, if that is causing attrition or loss of are people leaving the profession?
I do worry about retaining quality staff people as the stress gets to them. I would say in our particular situation, my staff have been steadfast. They're committed to their work. They love their community. They realize that these efforts are not representative of the majority of their community, and they receive a lot of positive feedback on a daily basis that fills their tank, so to speak, and that is tremendously helpful. Long term, I see job postings across the state for library director jobs that seem to be impossible to fill. And I know that there are consequences in those communities where book challenge situations have gotten extreme, where professionally no one is interested in stepping foot into that situation at all.
I think that there is sort of nationally kind of a movement away from libraries. But I'll also say, as I said to begin with, I mean, this is the most important work any of us will do in our career. And frankly, I mean, your value as a human being really is like really dependent on what you did when it was hard. You know, anybody can stand around and collect like awards when it's easy, but what did you do when it was hard? Did you show up? Did you fight? I mean, I think that what we're fighting for is much bigger than any of us. It's bigger than this industry. It's worth fighting for. And I understand that people get run down and beat up. At the Kent District Library, we spend a lot of time with team building. We're very empathetic. We're there in the moment, you know, lifting people up. We all kind of help each other up, but we have to stand strong now. And frankly, I mean, I hope that other libraries are doing the same thing, understanding that this is the time for us to stand up and show up. Because if we don't show up now, we may not get a chance to do it later. And what we lose is so important. It'll change everything in this country.
And I hope to anyone in the field just starting out or who's maybe been in it for a while knows that their fellow librarians are there for them as well. Sometimes it's just for listening, sometimes it's for advice. Yeah, we're a pretty tight-knit group and we roll together pretty strongly. So that has been a tremendous help to me and to people.
I think we're closing now, but I want to thank all of you, my friends, and fight on. Fight on.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and attending this event today. We are so glad that you were able to participate. And thank you to our moderator as well as our panelists so much just for your knowledge and insight. It was truly valued. Everybody, there's refreshments, and we just want to thank you again.